Pleasure is a powerful force in our lives. It makes us reach for an extra slice of cake, stay up too late watching movies, or daydream about winning the lottery. But what happens when the pursuit of pleasure goes too far? When it overshadows everything else, morality, responsibility, and even the well-being of others? In Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, we find a disturbing answer through the character of Humbert Humbert, a man whose relentless pursuit of illicit pleasure leads him down a path of destruction. Freud's pleasure principle, arguably the driving force behind Humbert's actions, reveals how the pursuit of pleasure, when unchecked, can consume a person entirely. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, introduced the concept of the pleasure principle as a fundamental aspect of human psychology. Simply put, it's the idea that we instinctively seek pleasure and avoid pain. Freud described it as the mechanism by which the mental apparatus seeks to keep off and to diminish the strength of excitations which reach it. In other words, our brains are like pleasure-seeking missiles, and Humbert's, well, his guidance system is way off. This principle governs the id, the most primitive part of our psyche, which demands immediate gratification of our desires, and in contrast, the reality principle, governed by the ego, helps us steer through existence by considering consequences and cultural rules before acting. It's a delicate balance, but chaos ensues when the pleasure principle dominates, as in Humbert's case. Humbert says, "You see, I loved her. It was love at first sight, at last sight, at ever and ever sight." Romantic? It could be under other circumstances. Creepy? Absolutely. Humbert isn't a man in love. He's obsessed. His attraction to Lolita becomes an all-consuming force that drives him to manipulate and deceive everyone around him. He doesn't think about the consequences of his actions, only about satisfying his twisted desires. This is the pleasure principle at work, showing what happens when a person's desires become their sole focus, regardless of the harm they cause. And despite the clear connections between Humbert's behavior and Freudian theory, Nabokov was no fan of Freud. He often mocked Freudian ideas in his other works, suggesting that he didn't want his literature to be pigeonholed into psychoanalytic interpretations. Yet, Lolita is filled with Freudian concepts, even if Nabokov didn't consciously intend it. And this creates an interesting tension in the novel. On one hand, Nabokov distances himself from Freud's theories, but on the other, he presents a character who perfectly embodies them. Humbert's id, the most primitive part of his psyche, is in control, driving him to seek immediate gratification without considering the moral or social consequences. Nabokov might have rejected Freud, but Humbert's story aligns with Freud's ideas in a way that's hard to ignore. It's as if Nabokov was saying, "I don't believe in Freud, but here's the perfect case study." Humbert embodies the id unleashed. His obsession with young Dolores Hayes, whom he nicknames Lolita, becomes a consuming force that overrides all sense of right and wrong. From the moment he first lays eyes on her, Humbert is driven by an insatiable desire to possess her and fulfill his fantasies. But how does Humbert actually manipulate his way into Lolita's life? The novel reveals that Humbert strategically marries Lolita's mother, Charlotte Hayes, to gain access to her daughter. His marriage is a cold calculation, a means to an end. And when Charlotte dies suddenly in a car accident, Humbert seizes the opportunity, taking Lolita on a cross-country trip under the guise of being her guardian. Throughout their travels, Humbert uses manipulation, threats, and emotional blackmail to control Lolita, keeping her isolated from the world and dependent on him. And in doing so, he turns his twisted desire into reality. He is not the tragic lover he often paints himself. This was a lone child, an absolute waif, with whom a heavy-limbed, foul-smelling adult had had strenuous intercourse 3 times that very morning. But Humbert's journey is not without internal conflict. There are moments in the novel where he is acutely aware of the moral abyss he is sinking into. He knows what he is doing is wrong, yet he cannot stop himself. As readers, we fall into a similar abyss, tempted to empathize with him, all the while knowing that he's really just a twisted pedophile. And the struggle between his desire for pleasure and the reality of his actions illustrates the tension between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. Humbert's self-awareness is reflected in his early acknowledgement. I knew I'd fallen in love with Lolita forever, but I also knew she would not be forever Lolita. This is Humbert's way of saying, I realize this is a terrible idea, but I'm doing it anyway. As Humbert spirals deeper into his obsession, the pleasure principle reveals its darker side. The pursuit of pleasure, unchecked by reality or morality, leads to the degradation of his character. He becomes increasingly paranoid, manipulative, and self-destructive. His once grandiose self-image crumbles as he realizes that the pleasure he sought has only brought him pain. Alas, I was unable to transcend the simple human fact that whatever spiritual solace I might find, whatever lithophanic eternities might be provided for me, nothing could make my Lolita forget the foul lust I had inflicted upon her. Nabokov deftly shows how the very thing Humbert thought would bring him happiness ultimately leads to his undoing. And Freud described this paradox in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, noting that the pleasure principle is in fact under constant threat from a contrary tendency. It's the psychological equivalent of reaching for a cookie only to have the jar fall on your foot, except much worse. The novel reaches its climax when Lolita, now a teenager, escapes Humbert's control, leaving Humbert alone and devastated. Humbert's pursuit of Lolita ends in a tragic, almost farcical showdown with Claire Quilty, a rival who had also sought to possess Lolita. After killing Quilty, Humbert is finally arrested and the novel closes with him awaiting trial, reflecting on his crimes and his love for Lolita. His final thoughts reveal a man consumed by guilt and regret, yet unable to fully grasp the magnitude of his actions. Humbert's story ends not with the fulfillment of his desires, but with the hollow realization that his pursuit of pleasure has destroyed everything, including himself. While Freud's theories help us understand Humbert's psychological state, a feminist critique shines a light on the real-world damage his actions cause. Humbert isn't a man pursuing pleasure. He's a predator, using his power to control and exploit a young girl. Lolita is only 12 years old when Humbert becomes obsessed with her, and he doesn't care about her feelings, autonomy, or right to a normal childhood. Feminist scholars like Susan Borda have argued that Lolita is a story about the abuse of power. Humbert's obsession goes beyond the selfish fulfillment of his desires. He wants to take away Lolita's agency. He reduces her to an object, a tool for his gratification, completely ignoring the fact that she is a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. Humbert actively manipulates to keep his pubescent concubine in submission and passible temper. Now, let's take this back to Freud. Freud didn't stop at the pleasure principle. He also introduced the concept of the death drive, which suggests that humans have an unconscious desire for self-destruction. And this concept is key to understanding why Humbert continues down his destructive path, even when he knows that it's ruining his life. As Humbert's obsession with Lolita grows, so does his paranoia and his tendency to repeat the same destructive behaviors. Freud notes there is something else at work beyond the pleasure principle, which is evident in Humbert's ultimate fate. Sometimes people just aren't satisfied until they've really messed things up. And Freud called this the repetition compulsion, where people keep making the same mistakes even when they know better. Humbert is a perfect example of this, as he continues to make choices that lead to his eventual downfall. He knows he's heading for disaster but can't stop himself. The death drive explains why Humbert is drawn to behaviors that lead to his own ruin, as if he's unconsciously seeking to punish himself for his desires. He knows what he's doing is wrong, yet he's unable or unwilling to stop. This is where the reality principle comes in. Freud described it as the part of our psyche that helps us balance our desires with the reality of the world around us. And in Humbert's case, the reality principle is weak, overshadowed by his overwhelming need for pleasure. It deftly shows how Humbert's obsession blinds him to everything else. His pursuit of pleasure leads him to manipulate and deceive, causing harm not only to Lolita but also to himself. And by the end of the novel, Humbert's life is in shambles and he is left to reflect on the destruction he has caused. His final realization that his pursuit of pleasure has only brought pain illustrates the dangers of allowing the pleasure principle to dominate unchecked. While Humbert's perspective dominates the narrative, we can't lose sight of Lolita's experience. Humbert's actions shatter her life, and her voice is the one we should be paying attention to. The real horror of Lolita isn't in Humbert's psychological struggle. It's the way his pursuit of pleasure destroys a young girl's life. And Nabokov forces us to see the high cost of Humbert's pleasure, Lolita's stolen childhood, her loss of innocence, and her broken sense of self. This is the real tragedy of the novel, and it can't be ignored. Seeking pleasure may be a part of being human, but taken to extremes, it becomes decidedly inhuman. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world, and we are on a mission for 1,000 subscribers. And this one might be the one to watch next.